So as I promised before, in this video I want to talk a little bit about definitions, and I'm going to point out some of the wrinkles in some of these concepts that you can use to gain yourself a little bit of ground at the outset of the debate. I'm going to talk about the definition of competition, the definition of cooperation, a couple of things about the definition of excellence, and then I have a couple of negative approaches I've been thinking about that I want to share with you, and then I have a couple of resources that I think you ought to look at that you'll get some useful material from. To begin with the definition of competition, you'll find that competition is defined a number of different ways. It's defined in games theory, it's defined in social psychology, it's defined in sociology, but what those definitions tend to have in common is that there is a comparison of outcomes to whatever the activity is, and competence makes a difference. So if you run a certain distance and someone holds a stopwatch, and then someone else runs a certain distance and they use the stopwatch on the second person, then there's comparison because they see who ran it in the least amount of time, and competence makes a difference because whoever's the fastest runner, that's going to pretty much determine it. If the second person, for example, used a bicycle or a Segway or something, the difference wouldn't be who was the fastest runner, the difference would be the machine that they used, and so that wouldn't really be a fair competition. You know, most fair observers would say that that wasn't a competition at all. Now, a couple of the wrinkles. One of them is, think about a situation in which you try to break the record set by a person whom you've never met. Maybe you try to break a record set by someone who died before you were even born. That would meet the definition of competition. And the interesting thing about that is competition does not require confrontation. It doesn't require that you be in the same place as another person at the same time. As a matter of fact, competition doesn't really require that you be aware of who your competitors are. If you add in the definition that you are aware of your competitor, then really what you're dealing with is conflict. And you could early on in the debate, when laying out your ground, laying out your interpretation, distinguish competition from conflict, because conflict is always expressed. Conflict always involves interaction, and the resolution doesn't require you to defend conflict. It only requires you to defend competition. You could give as an illustration, and maybe you can think of a better one than this, think of, say, a woman who has two men who both want very badly for her to marry them. They may both be dating her, they may both be courting her, they might both be completely unaware of one another. And they might be involved in a competition that neither one of them is aware that they're really involved in. But there is still a comparison of outcomes. One gets to marry her and the other does not, and competence makes a difference. Whichever one succeeds in making himself appealing to her is the one who gets the prize. So thinking a little bit about cooperation. In the definition of cooperation, the elements that stand out are that the effort is pooled and the benefit also is pooled. Everybody shares in contributing the effort, and everybody shares in the rewards as well. And the elements that will come out of various in-depth definitions of cooperation are that there is interdependence. So not only do I depend on you, but you depend on me. So it's not really a cooperative activity if one person is doing all the work and the other person is dependent on the one who's providing the effort. We all need to be putting in a little bit of effort for it to be cooperative. Secondly, there is coordination. Whatever we're doing, we account for one another. We adjust what we do to make more effective the whole combined effort. We don't just do what we do, ignoring everybody else. The third element is common goals. It's not really cooperation unless there's at least some overlap in what we're trying to do. If I have no idea what your purpose is, and you have no idea what my purpose is, then it's really stretching things to call that cooperation. And finally, mutual benefit, which is the idea that the benefit is pooled. If we all put in effort, we will all take benefit out of the situation. Now, the interesting thing is, not everything that looks like, it really kind of depends on what your unit of analysis is, whether you call something cooperation or not, because one thing that we in the communication field will sometimes distinguish from cooperation is what we call coaction. Let me give you an example of the difference between cooperation and coaction. Let's say you and another person are in a class, and the two of you are studying together, and you're quizzing each other, and you're pooling your notes, and you're using flashcards back and forth so that both of you will do really well on the one test that both of you have to take. Well, that would be cooperative. You're both putting in your effort, and you both presumably are going to share in the rewards. Well, now let's imagine you're both sitting at the table, you're both studying, but each one is studying a different subject in preparation for a different test. Well, in the communication field, we would tend to call that coaction. You're in the same space, You're doing about the same thing, but you're not doing it interactively. But now let me complicate it a little bit. What if you and another person decide cooperatively to clean a house? And you go in and clean the bathroom, and the other person goes and cleans the kitchen. Well, is that cooperation or is that coaction? What if you are both cleaning the kitchen, but one of you does the floor and the other one is doing all the counters? Is that cooperation or is it coaction? The question is, what's the unit of analysis? What is the job? Do the two of you both have to have your hand on the same sponge and both be moving it back and forth for it to be cooperation? Going back to the example of two people studying for two different tests, well, what if your purpose in studying at the same table together is you both give each other social support? It's easier to study for longer and not get distracted if there's another person there who's also studying, if it's someone that you like, so you have an appointment and you know that you'll be letting them down if you don't come, so you make it a point to show up and study. Is that cooperative? If both of you are trying to improve one another's grades, even if you're not studying the same subject. So, in thinking about what cooperation means, you have to ask, how do we draw the boundary around what the task is? Do we make it very specific, in which case probably very little is cooperative and many things would be considered coaction? Or do we make the goals very vague, in which almost anything could be considered cooperation? You know, we all cooperate in making the biosphere go just by being alive. So those are things that you're going to want to think about in sort of analyzing what your interpretation of the topic is going to be. Now, some of the concepts that go with cooperation and competition deal with the symbiosis between them. I don't think you're going to have that much problem with the concept of co-opetition. I imagine that a lot of people, when they get their first look at the fact that people are writing essays, articles, and even entire books about co-opetition, they think, oh gosh, there's the balance negative right there. But the encounters I've had so far with writings about co-opetition are actually pretty encouraging, because what they do is they consider in any given situation, is there more cooperation or more competition, which really kind of helps out the interpretation that the affirmative can take that makes the balance negative not very easy to win. That interpretation being, yes, we understand that they are both at work in every situation, but what this resolution asks is, which one is contributing more to excellence? Even if they're both present, which one is dominant? And it really is looking as though a lot of the co-opetition scholarship focuses on that, which one is dominant. Now, there's a little bit of difference because they tend to talk about which one do we see more, which one do we observe more. But I'm willing to bet if you do a little bit of that reading, get into that literature a little bit, that affirmatives are going to find more opportunities for beating back balance negatives than negatives are going to find comfort in writing balance negatives. A couple of other things to think about in the relationship between cooperation and competition. There's a difference between what a person's internal motivation is and what a social encounter is set up to be. So it could be that the interaction, as it was organized, is intended to be cooperative, but the people's motives are competitive. Think about if you were at your workplace and your boss assigned you and another person to cooperate on a task. And you knew that sometime soon your boss was going to make a decision who to promote. You might cooperate with the other person. You might be very careful to be seen cooperating with the other person. You might very carefully choreograph your cooperation with the other person. And the activity would seem to all observers cooperative, but in your mind it would be competitive, because your purpose would be to look better to your boss than the other person so that you would be in line to get the promotion. There are also situations where people will cooperate in a setup, in an encounter that is intended to be competitive in nature. A lot of times very good friends will go out and shoot one-on-one basketball, and there'll be a lot of play involved, and they'll bend the rules, and they'll reenact old inside jokes and so forth, and it's a game, and you can very clearly see how it's competitive. There's scorekeeping, there are rules, but at the same time, both people understand what they want out of the activity, and one person might let the other person win. You know, you might think about an adult playing with a small child and letting the small child win the game because that's exciting. The setup is competitive, but still there's a cooperative element there. So, what the internal motivation is and what the nature of the activity is, you have to distinguish between the two of those, and you're going to have to work out what that means for your interpretation.